My name is Adam Rudinsky, and I'm the Chief Deputy of the Consumer Protection Division for Santa Monica's City Attorney's Office. And on behalf of the City Attorney's Office, I want to welcome all of you to this great event. And we are going to be commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, and honoring the long and hard work and struggles of those folks that made the act happen, one of whom is here today, and also talk about where we've come in the last 50 years and where we are now in these strange new times we find ourselves in for housing, fair housing, and other things. So we have an incredible lineup of speakers here today that really we've never seen the likes of in one event for the city of Santa Monica before in the area of fair housing. And to kick things off, I'd like to turn this over to Janet Turner, who's the field supervisor for our friendly neighborhood Congressman, Ted Lieu. Would you please welcome Janet?
Good afternoon. Isn't it a beautiful day? And I am so excited to hear the speakers today. I send best wishes from Congressman Ted Lieu on this celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. He wants to send his appreciation to the city of Santa Monica for its exemplary fair housing programs. In 2016, the House passed Resolution 714, supporting the goals and ideals of the Fair Housing Act, which included bringing attention to the discrimination faced by minority populations in the U.S. Many are homeless because of discrimination in housing, and the Congressman co-sponsored with Representative Maxine Waters H.R. 2076, the Ending Homeless Act of 2017. This comprehensive bill aims to combat homelessness and provide $1 billion to the Housing Trust Fund for an affordable housing program and targets particular funds for rental assistance. So that's one way of trying to help in this situation. Today, more than ever, there is a need to stand behind the Fair Housing Act. We need to be vigilant. Right in 2018 already, HUD has delayed the affirmatively further fair housing rule. Of course, violations of the fair housing laws do still occur each year against people of protected classes, and the Office of Congressman Lieu does help people with these kinds of cases communicate with HUD directly. So the Congressman feels the Fair Housing Act promotes integration and the basic American principle that all men are created equal. He commends again the city of Santa Monica for its dedication and commitment to fair housing. And thank you so very much, Adam.
Thank you, Janet. So I want to turn things over to Gary Rhodes in a moment. Gary is a deputy city attorney in our office, has been with us for more than 11 years now, and he really is an illustrious fair housing guru in his own right. Gary's dedicated a large part of his legal career to fighting for housing rights throughout the state of California, and most recently for many years in our office. And this event that we have here today was the brainchild of Gary Rhodes, who's been, I think, planning this for about 50 years. So please welcome Gary.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today. Actually, Adam, my work on planning this and working with the great speakers it never felt like work. It felt like more like the history buff in me was getting to geek out with some really cool civil rights history. And that's especially true for my time with our first speaker, Senator Fred Harris. And what I have here is just a very brief summary of his amazing life. Senator Harris was twice elected to the U.S. Senate from Oklahoma as a progressive and reform-minded senator beginning in 1964. As the national chair of the Democratic Party in 1969 and 1970, he worked hard for the reform of the party to make it more democratic, as well as much more representative of women and people of color. In 1976, he was an unsuccessful but influential 1976 Democratic candidate for President of the United States, especially an amazing run at the Iowa caucuses. Senator Harris is now a professor emeritus of political science at the University of New Mexico, where he also continues as director of the university's Fred Harris Congressional Internship Program. Along with his teaching and writing career, Harris, who is fluent in Spanish, has been a Fulbright Scholar in Mexico, a visiting professor at Mexico's National University, and has taught and lectured throughout Latin America, Europe, and Asia. Senator Harris has produced 19 nonfiction books on politics, government, and policy. And he's also the award-winning author of 3 critically acclaimed novels. He continues to be a citizen and a political activist at the national levels and state levels, along with a busy public speaking and publishing schedule. And that included an NPR interview last year with Robert Siegel, which is where I first learned of his intense involvement with our topic today. So he has been leading quite the full and generous and American life like few people have. And from that full life, the one thing that we noticed was his role, not only his vote for the passage of the Fair Housing Act, but his role in getting it passed, because it went through a very stormy trip to get to where it got to. And that began in 1967 when he proposed to Congress and then directly to President Lyndon Johnson that a national commission be formed to look at the issue of race in America, especially discrimination and especially segregation that was, that was boiling over in the form of riots in some of our cities. President Johnson liked Senator Harris's idea. He formed that commission, and of course he appointed Senator Harris to be on that. Be careful what you wish for sometimes, right? That commission, the Kerner Commission, and its groundbreaking report on race in America would go on to play a key role for the law that we are commemorating today. To tell us more about it, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Senator Fred Harris. I'll do these for you. Just let me know when you want your picture up.
Just now, I think.
All right.
Thank you very much.
And by the way, we're going to save questions for the very end of the day. There's like a 40-minute question-answer session we can have at the end of the day for all the speakers.
Thank you, Gary, very much. I'm really honored to be here on the occasion of this conference, past, present, and future of fair housing. Most of you here know more about housing and affordable housing and fair housing than I do, but my wife, Margaret, who's here with me at lunch today, was reminding me that I do know a lot about housing instability. I grew up I was born in southwestern Oklahoma, and we lived out in the country for a while, moved into town in the second grade, into Walters, this little town of about 1,500 population. Years and years later, I decided some years ago to write a book about growing up in a small town like that during the depths of the Depression. And I was going to call it Before the World Changed, because with World War II, everything really changed. I took Margaret to my little hometown, and doing research, I drove her out the various streets and just to look at the town. And as we were moving along, I'd say, we used to live there, and we used to live there, and we used to live there. And I've always hated to move. I didn't know exactly why until that moment, but it turned out we had lived in the 10-year period between the time I was in the second grade until I graduated from high school. We lived in 12 different houses, an average of more than one a year. And Margaret said to me, why did you all move so much? And I had no idea. My sister still lived in Walters, and of course everybody else that might have known something, my parents, were dead. But she found a woman in a nursing home who'd been a close friend of my mother's, and she went and asked her. And this woman, Lillian Williams, she said, well, your mother could do anything, which was true. But she could carpenter, paint, hang wallpaper, whatever. And she said what would happen is all these houses were rented, of course. You'd move into a house, and your mother would fix it up, and the landlord would raise the rent, and so you'd move out, start again, fix that house up, then raise the rent, and move again. I don't know whether that's true or not, but when we got back to Albuquerque, or Corrales, where I live, I was telling a couple of guys about that, and one of them said, well, you know, Fred, looks like you would have finally got the message. You keep coming home from school at the end of the day, and your folks have moved and left no forwarding address. The other guy said, it's a good thing, Fred, that you didn't get elected president, because it would have bankrupted the country to make shrines out of every one of the houses where you'd lived. Fred Harris lived here, and he lived here. Well, I'm really pleased to be here with people that are really doing kind of the Lord's work. And I think it's wonderful to have this celebration of fair housing and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And I'm really pleased to be associated with people that are doing such good work here in Santa Monica and in California. I've been asked, Gary asked me to talk about fair housing, but from the national standpoint. Others are going to talk about it from the state and the city standpoint. But in the context of the 1968 report of the Kerner Commission, of which I'm the last surviving member, and which famously found, as some of you will remember, our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. We all know, we've read, or remember that the summer of 1967 was really, as they called it, a long, hot summer. There were riots and disorders in the black sections of many America's cities. The two worst were in Detroit and in Newark, which weren't quelled until the president had called out the Army troops to replace the National Guard and the police who'd been mishandling the trying to restore order. There were many deaths, most of them African Americans, and most of those innocent, great property damage, and this kind of terrible disorder, which went on for weeks and was so widespread, caused enormous shock and fear and alarm, outrage, bewilderment, anxiety all throughout the country. At the height of the Detroit riot in July of that year, 67, I went to the Senate floor and grabbed up my seatmate Walter Mondale, a senator from Minnesota, later vice president, got him to co-author a resolution, which I introduced, to create a Blue Ribbon Citizens Commission to look into into the riots, not just from the law and order standpoint, but also to get at the basic causes of the disorders and to recommend action, as the resolution said, to make real immediately the promise of America for all Americans. I got the resolution sent to the subcommittee that I chaired, and the very next morning had hearings on it. Had Daniel Patrick, Moynihan, not then a senator, and Whitney Young, head of the Urban League, testify in favor of it. And then I realized that the President Johnson, could create the commission himself just by executive order. And so I got in touch with Daniel Cater down at the White House and sent a letter also for the same purpose to get the President to go ahead and appoint the commission himself. And in a few days, it was announced that he was going to have a nationwide telecast and appoint such a commission. So I had some neighbors over. We moved a television set into the living room so we could watch the President's telecast. And about 10 minutes before he was to go on the air, My youngest daughter then, I think in the second or third grade, Laura, she came running out of the kitchen where we had a wall telephone, and she said, Daddy, President Johnson's on the phone for you. Well, that caused quite a stir. I went into the kitchen and got the phone. Yes, sir, Mr. President. And he said, Fred, I hope you're going to watch television tonight. This is word for word. And I said, we are, yes. He said, I'm going to appoint that commission you've been talking about. And I said, I think that's a good thing to do. He said, I'm going to put you on it. Well, I said, I never expected that, but I'll do the best I can. He said, now don't be like some of your colleagues. I point them to things and they never show up. I said, I'll show up and I'll work at it. And he said, another thing, Fred. I said, yes, sir, Mr. President. He said, I want you to remember that you're a Johnson man. I said, yes, sir, I am a Johnson man. He said, if you forget it, I'll take my pocket knife and cut your blank off. He did not say blank. I went back into the living room, and they said, what did he say? What did he say? I said, well, some of it was kind of personal. The sad fact is, Johnson thought I did forget. I was a Johnson man. He rejected our eventual report, which I thought was particularly sad because Johnson, as president, did more against poverty and for civil rights than any president we've had before or since. But he didn't like this report. He called us together by telegram, the urgency of the situation. The Detroit riot was still going on. And we got underway right away, the commission. We spent 20 days right off the reel, 23 as a matter of fact, for not public hearings. They should have been public. We made a mistake not having public hearings to bring people along with us as to what we found and saw. We heard some 130 witnesses, ranging from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. And then we hired a terrific staff. They went all over the country, particularly where the riots had occurred. They conducted hundreds of interviews. And then the commission itself divided into teams and went out personally to some of these riot cities. We were a team, John Lindsay and I. John Lindsay was the mayor of New York. We were of totally different backgrounds, but we bonded at once and recognized that we were on exactly the same level in regard to what we thought ought to be done and what the causes of these riots were. We went, for example, we were in Cincinnati. It took our staff about 2 weeks to get a meeting put together of some young militant African Americans, women and men. They didn't want to meet with us, but they finally did. None of them would shake hands with us. None of them would look us in the eye. And they said, we don't want to have any dealings with white people. You white politicians not going to do anything anyway. Well, John and I knew about conditions in the cities, and we knew there was that kind of bitterness and anger, but we saw it in actuality. We saw the people. We went to Milwaukee, for example, and I spent the morning in a black barber shop in the black section of Milwaukee. And I saw young men after young men who'd come from the South, criminally inferior school systems, come and looking for jobs, just at the time when automation and other factors had eliminated so many jobs. Most of them were out of work, wanted work. And I asked a question each the first three or so that came along that puzzled them. They didn't know how to answer. And the question was, do you find as much segregation here in Milwaukee, as you found back home in Birmingham or in Jackson, Mississippi, they didn't know how to answer, because eventually it came out in Milwaukee they didn't see any white people at all. There was far more segregation in Milwaukee than they'd found in the South where they'd come from. Well, all of us commissioners, after going around the country to these riot cities, came back very shaken and sober. I got them a room in the Capitol where we could meet, and we met for 44 straight days. We read every single word aloud and voted on all these words. The commissioners did, sometimes on the really tough votes. For example, saying racism. Some said, well, shouldn't we say tolerance or discrimination? Well, we ought to call it what it is. And we did. It's the first government document ever to talk about straight out racism. Some of these votes, like that one, were 6-5. But by the time we got at the end of all these days, we adopted our report unanimously. And the executive director always used to say, this is the first unanimous report that was adopted by a 6-5 vote, which was just about right. We were asked 3 questions by President Johnson. What happened? Why did it happen? And what can be done to prevent it happening again? The commission was convinced that the riots had not been the result of some conspiracy, as President Johnson and some others believed, and we decided to say so straight out. We said, quote, the urban disorders of the summer of 1967 were not caused by, nor were they the consequence of, any organized plan or conspiracy. The commission detailed how for 2 decades following World War II, roughly 1945 to 1965, African Americans began to migrate into the nation's cities, many being refugees from the desperate poverty and terrible degradation of the rural and small-town South. They came to places like Newark and Detroit and Milwaukee, as I said, looking for jobs, just at a time, as I said, when the jobs were moving outside the city limits or they were disappearing altogether. These new residents found northern city segregation that was rigid as the southern states they'd left, as I said. 3 and 4 families might move into the rented rooms of what had once been old single-family houses, maybe turned away from the already packed housing projects as white flight began to rapidly turn the central city black. There were unresolved conflicts, terrible conflicts, with nearly all white police departments. And that grew, those hostilities did, to the extent that almost any spark could set off an explosion. The commission then truthfully laid out the facts in detail about the riots and about the way they'd been handled and mishandled by the police and the National Guard. And then the question, why did it happen? The commission, condemned violence in strong terms. We said, quote, violence cannot build a better society. Disruption and disorder nourish repression, not justice. The community cannot, it will not, tolerate coercion and mob rule. Violence and destruction must be ended. But while the commission, after all its hearings and studies, could not say for sure why violence occurred in one place and not another, why, for example, there was a riot in the Watts section here in Los Angeles in 1965, for example, but not in 1967. Or why no 1967 riots occurred in Washington, D.C. In 1968, or Baltimore, though they did in 1968. The commission could and did describe with particularity the conditions which existed in the places where riots had occurred. And they declared, we did, that those conditions and white racism were the root causes of the riots. The Commission's report had as its basic conclusion, our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Segregation and poverty, we said, have created in the racial ghetto a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans. What white Americans have never fully understood, we said, but what the Negro can never forget is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. And then we got to the third question. We'd made a decision very early. This is one of the things that I advocated. Let's answer each question in order, not go to the next one until we've answered that one. And so when we got to the last question, after answering the first two, we were already locked in, just as I expected, to our answers as a result of those answers. And so we said, what we have to have is great and sustained national efforts. That's required not only to combat racism, but also to expand social programs, integration of housing and schools, other programs, social programs, including those against unemployment and low wages, poverty, inferior or inadequate education and training, lack of health care, and bad or non-existent housing. The Commission was honest in saying that these programs will require unprecedented levels of funding. The report also made strong recommendations to improve the conduct of the media and the police, as well as the hostile, toxic police-community relations that existed throughout the country. While the Commission understood that just dealing with economic class issues without special attention to the problems of racism and discrimination, and today we would add women's rights and immigrant rights, that would have been fundamentally inadequate. The Commission also knew that their recommended solutions would not apply to black people or city people only. Instead, the report declared quite broadly, it's time to make good the promises of American democracy to all citizens, urban and rural, white and black, Spanish surname, as we said then, American Indian, and every minority group. So we made a deal very early with the Bantam Books of the New York Times to bring out a pocketbook edition of our report at the same time the report was officially released, and that was to be on March 1st, 1968. That deal with Bantam Books made certain that our report, no matter what, no matter how the President might react, could not be suppressed or locked away, unreleased. Nobody or nothing could stop that release. And we also set up, we gave out copies of the report embargoed to give us time to background members of the media generally, because we knew that people who hadn't seen the same things we had were going to be shocked by white racism and about the kind of programs and a great expense that we were talking about, and we wanted to help these reporters and others to really understand why we had made these kind of findings and recommendations. But at the last moment, somebody with evil intent, and we kind of think we know who, leaked a copy of the report to the Washington Post. And the Post said, there's a great movie right now with the publication of The Right Kind of Leak. The Post said, we're going to go ahead, we got this legally, and we're going to go with a story in the morning. There was just absolute chaos. Our executive director said, well, we're going to turn it loose to everybody if you do that, so you won't get an exclusive. But they said, we're going to go ahead, and we did turn it loose to everybody. And it was just chaotic, as I said. I got a call, I remember, from an Associated Press reporter who said, this is a 600-page report, and he said, I have a 30-minute deadline. Can you just capsulize it for me? The result was that in the morning Washington Post and in newspapers and media outlets all over the country, the headlines were, White Racism Cause of Black Riots, Commission Says. Well, a lot of people supported a lot of leaders, the report, but a lot of people did not. There was a lot of backlash in the country. The comment my own father made to me was, my father was a small farmer in southwest Oklahoma, had a third-grade education. He loved me, but the way he heard our report, the Kerner report, was, Mr. Harris, out of the goodness of your heart, you ought to pay more taxes in order to help poor black people who are rioting in Detroit. And he basically said, to hell with that. I'm having a hard enough time myself, which was true. He learned because we talked about it. But a lot of people in the country never did learn that we were interested in them also, and that what we had recommended fit everybody in the country. As I said, a lot of leaders did support the Kerner report, leaders like Vice President Hubert Humphrey, Senator Robert Kennedy of New York, my seatmate in the Senate, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who called the report, quote, a physician's warning of approaching death with a prescription for life. Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, John Gardner, said, we're in deep trouble as a people, and history will not deal kindly with any nation which will not tax itself to cure its miseries. So apt today. Best of all, I thought, was Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz. He said, the Kerner report can be summarized in the words of that great American philosopher, Pogo, who said, we have met the enemy, and he is us. Well, despite the opposition, following the Kerner report, America made progress in virtually every aspect of race and poverty for nearly 10 years. Then, with burgeoning globalization, increasing automation, conservative political change, and eventually an unfriendly Supreme Court and their decisions, progress was slowed or stopped and finally reversed. With some improvement during the Bill Clinton and Barack Obama administrations, regression has been the trend since about the mid-1970s. And that, I'm sorry to say, is true today. The number of African Americans and Latino elected officials has increased since 1968, of course, as did their numbers in the middle class and in all aspects of American life. America elected its first African American president, who, to my mind, is the smartest and best motivated president I've ever had anything to do with. I don't know if any of you saw the other night that interview with Barack Obama by David Letterman. Anybody see that? You ought to. It's on Netflix. Margaret and I, with tears in our eyes, sat and watched that. Thought to ourselves, there's our president. And it really... and it was sort of inspirational to think we could be that again, and that's what I'm talking about now. Yet, many inequities defining American society in 1968 remain the same or have gotten worse, as I said. There's still far too much discrimination on the basis of color. There's far too much excessive use of force by police, too often deadly force, especially against African Americans. White supremacists have become emboldened and more violent. Housing and schools have been rapidly resegregating, locking too many African Americans into slums and their children into inferior schools. Most Americans, I shouldn't say most, more Americans live in poverty today than in 1968. while our country was growing, the percentage of people who were poor stayed roughly the same. But that meant that numbers increased greatly. We have little over 40 million people who are in poverty today, compared to 25 million 50 years ago in 1968. The percentage of American children living in poverty increased from 15.6% in 1968 to 18% now in the last figures, 2016. Our child poverty is among the very highest among industrialized democracies. The percentage of Americans that are living in deep or extreme poverty, that is less than half the poverty threshold, has increased since 1975. The deep poverty rate for poor whites is higher than for poor African Americans and for Latino Americans. Only about a quarter of Americans eligible for low-income housing assistance receive it. There's been a drastic and dramatic reduction in low-income housing over recent years, and the government failure to enforce as it should, though you've done, I think, a far better job to enforce fair housing. Since the early 1970s, the African-American unemployment rate has been about twice the white unemployment rate. And now the African-American unemployment rate is higher than the white unemployment rate at all education levels. In 1967, that wasn't true. Since then, it wasn't true to say that CEO pay lagged. The ratio of CEO pay to worker pay was about 25 to 1 in 1967, and now the ratio is about 275 to 1. Productivity has been going up, but that hasn't turned in, as it used to, hasn't turned into higher wages. Labor union membership declined from about 25% in 73 to about 6% now of private jobs, weakening the bargaining power of workers and contributing to the suppression of their wages. In the 1970s, the richest 1% of Americans took home less than 9% of our national income. Now they take home something over 24%. In 2016, the last year, we have the figures for the median white household earned $65,000, the median Latino household $57,000, the median African American household $39,000. The wealthiest 1% of Americans today own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. And as of 2013, median white wealth was 12 times that of median African American wealth. After a dramatic decline in school segregation, especially in the South, discontinuance of desegregation assistance and court orders in many districts, coupled with the residential resegregation, has resegregated public schools. Just over a third of black students and just over 20% in the South attended intensely segregated schools in 1988, where minority students constituted 90% or more of the total. By 2010, that proportion nationally was 40%, 50% in the Northeast. High-poverty schools are almost entirely populated by black and Latino students, while low-poverty schools have very few such students. A majority of the students of African American and Latino descent attend public schools where 75% of the students are poor. Today, half as many African American students attend majority white schools, just over 20%, as did in 1988, 44%. High rates of poverty, housing segregation, economic polarization have left most African American and Hispanic students marooned in schools where economic struggle is the rule and financial stability and all the social and educational benefits from them are very much the exception. The explosive growth in incarceration disproportionately locks up black and Latino men. The American mass incarceration system has increased the present prison population, especially with these privately owned prisons, from about 200,000 at the time of the Kerner Commission report to about 1,400,000 today. African American men are nearly 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men. Latino men, 2.3 times as likely. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration among any industrialized democracies, and it's not even a contest. Although the American reported homicide rate is much higher than in most industrial democracies, our reported rate is close to the reported murder rates of the 1960s. Well, why do I tell you all that? Because when we talk about housing, where you live, among other things, makes a big difference. Not only that, but where you can afford to live and where you are allowed to live. And that's what's involved with this conference and what we're talking about today. We've just come out with a new book. I don't know whether they've got a cover. I've been working on this for about a year with another person, Dr. Alan Curtis, who's head of the Eisenhower Foundation. We're co-editors of a book called Healing Our Divided Society. It's really a kind of a Kerner Report 2.0, and goes into the problems that we face today as compared to 1968. It comes out on February the 27th, the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Report. Among the policies and programs which we advocate, here we are. There is the cover of this new book. What we advocate is full employment policy via rebuilding infrastructure and investing in alternative energy, child care, education, job training linked to job placement, a livable minimum wage, the strengthening of labor unions, single-payer health care, globalization trade accords that respect workers' rights, education policy focused on integration, and more equitable public school funding, as well as on improved training of teachers and so forth. And also much more affordable housing and fair housing. The people today, and I think all I've said is pretty pessimistic, but I'm basically an optimist. And one reason why I am is I don't believe I've ever seen as much activism, progressive activism, today as I've never seen that much before. We've not seen this kind of movement that we did with the civil rights movement until now. The civil rights movement, you'll have to remember, though, started at a time when, somebody even mentioned earlier, talk about when the NAACP was formed. That was at a time when rigid segregation, Jim Crow laws, all sorts of mistreatment of African Americans was the rule of the day. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, showed the Birth of a Nation film in the White House. And it was under his administration that all of Washington, the nation's capital, was rapidly segregated, all the federal buildings. And yet the NAACP formed with the courage to fight for change. And that was true also of what Dr. Martin Luther King and others faced in the Civil Rights March, despite the fact that there had not been any civil rights legislation in the country since the 1870s. So I'm encouraged by that kind of activism. The Women's March, nothing like it since the Civil Rights March. Indivisible, Black Lives Matter. People have begun to take matters into their own hands. We've got great new leaders. One of the greatest, I think, is Reverend William Barber of North Carolina, who is the leader of this Spreading Moral Mondays movement. And he's showing that white, black, and brown, poor and working class Americans can join hands in coalition with each other and with women, millennials, seniors, the LGBT community, immigrants, and others to work for their common interests and change things for the better, because, as my old campaign manager Jim Hightower always said, everybody does better when everybody does better. First of all, if we're going to have fair housing, people have to have enough money. People ask me this. I should back up and say, they say, well, how come there's so many homeless? They don't have homes. People say, how come there's so many poor people? They don't have any money. And we've got to help them get it. The best way to get it is with a job. But it seems to me that about housing, today, in order to afford a modest, two-bedroom home in America, renters need to earn over $21 an hour, while the federal minimum wage is stuck at $7.25. How do we get into this mess? How do we get into such a bad situation? And the answer is also sort of the spotlight on what direction we ought to go. One of the causes is new technology. A lot of the old blue-collar jobs that used to put and keep American workers in the middle class don't exist anymore. I read here lately, somebody said, if automation continues at its present rate, very soon every plant will just have one person in it and one dog. The man or woman person will be there to feed the dog. And the dog will be there to be sure that the person keeps his or her hands off the machinery. There's been talk about, we're going to bring back coal and we're going to bring back manufacturing. There are people who are never again going to have a good job, and we're going to have to pay attention to those people. There are other causes that are quite obvious. Income inequality. We've cut taxes for rich people and big corporations and cut programs, jobs, training, education, and now health that benefit poor people and working families. And a major reason why workers' wages stagnated or fell was the vicious, sustained, and successful attacks on unions. With most American workers having no union to fight for them, as productivity increased, they were unable to make demands for fear their employers could turn their jobs over to the numbers of unemployed and underemployed people who would be willing to work for almost any wage. We've shipped a great number of American jobs overseas to unbelievably low-wage countries. We've time and again made supply-side trickle-down economics our government policy, cutting taxes, giving subsidies to the rich and the big corporations, being falsely assured that they would invest this largesse in new jobs and better wages. And time and again, as you know, this is shown not to work. What we need instead is vigorous practice of Keynesian economics. Every president since Franklin Roosevelt, whether they admitted it or not, came around eventually to practice Keynesian economics, to leave more money, to give more money into the hands of consumers, and thereby stimulate the economy. I used to say, talking about that, I used to say when Nixon was president, I said, President Nixon, he ran against Keynesian economics, but then there was a terrible recession, and he endorsed, as I used to say, Lord Keynes like they were going steady. And I quit that because up in Pennsylvania one night, a young fellow came up to me afterwards and he said, that was really clever the way you said Nixon was gay. I said, I didn't mean to say Nixon was gay. I don't think Nixon was gay, is gay. And he said, well, Keynes was. So I started saying he embraced Keynesianism as we ought to be doing right now. What difference does it make we have so much poverty or inequality of income? Well, among other things, economic power translates into political power through the campaign financing system. And furthermore, as Joseph Stiglitz has said, our middle class is too weak now, shrunk, to support the consumer spending that has historically driven our economic growth. Economic power translates into political power. So this gets us back to housing. We've got to have a great deal more investment, federal level. We did very well for a long time, and then it more or less stopped with Ronald Reagan, and it never has picked up again to that stage. And I think that housing, affordable housing, ought to be like Medicaid, or Medicaid is theoretically available and funded for all those who are eligible for it. We also have got to renew our efforts. You all are pretty much already doing these things in regard to fair housing. There are several things that I think we certainly ought to do, and many of them I'm sure you're involved in now. We should widely replicate and greatly expand successfully evaluated mobility programs like the Chicago Gautreaux program and the Federal Moving to Opportunity program to encourage low-income and minority families to move into better neighborhoods, to provide financial incentives to much more widely replicate the other inclusionary zoning programs already in effect in over 100 jurisdictions nationwide, where developers have been offered incentives to set aside a specific number of housing units for lower income and minority families. We ought to adjust existing housing subsidies so that they're sufficient to allow low-income residents to rent housing in better neighborhoods. So this gets us to the final question of how can we get this done? I think that Dr. Martin Luther King's example points us the way. You remember that he had begun a poor people's march, the demands of which were jobs and equality. And it was that economic justice message that took him to Memphis, Tennessee, where he was cruelly murdered. He went there to support that city's multiracial garbage workers. I think we've got to build on that coalition of common interests that exist among us all. We can't do it just by joining hands and singing Solidarity Forever. That won't make a multiracial and multi-class people's movement, but what will? Standing up for job guarantees, the recognition that in a nation where there's so many jobs which need doing, everybody has a right to a job at a living wage. Income for those who can't work or who've lost their job through no fault of their own and can't find work. A good, free public education for all, especially starting with early childhood and then all the way through college. Education and training with special attention and special provision for jobs and income for those who are put out of work by circumstances beyond their control. Health care for all. The basic American principles of equal rights and equal opportunity for all, whatever a person's social standing or zip code, religion, gender, or color. Fair and progressive taxation, getting the rich and the giant corporations off welfare. I agree with Reverend William Barber, who says, we can't keep fighting in our silos. No more separating issues, labor over here, voting rights over there. The same people fighting one should have to fight all of us together. As you know, America could not have advanced in modern times, I feel this strongly, without grassroots movements, the labor union movement, or the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. The kind of people's movement we're talking about is around economic and racial justice, and building what the Kerner Commission called New Will can evolve from these earlier movements and enhance the needs of our time, restoring America's promise at home and abroad. Representative John Lewis, whom I think is a living saint, would say, do something, get in the way, shake things up. We must make common cause with people who are our natural allies and change things. Dolores Huerta, my fellow New Mexican, she started in New Mexico before she came out here as a partner in agitation with Cesar Chavez, and is the subject of a great 2017 documentary film. She was the one that taught us to say, she dreamed up the phrase, "Sí se puede," yes we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Harris. Those were amazing words and amazing history and amazing current state of the country, statistics. I have one more picture that we didn't get to here. So this is Senator Harris in the middle of the Kerner Commission, right here, looking right at you. All right. So I said earlier that working on this event and planning it was a lot of fun, and as you can see from or listen to Senator Harris, you can imagine how great that was to work with him. Another reason it was great to work on this was because we got a new city attorney while we were working on it, and I got to work with Lane Dilg for the first time, and Adam and Lane and I brainstormed on how to make this event better and how to bring in the very best speakers for it. So I'm going to ask her to come up now and introduce our next speaker.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here today. We are so happy to put on this event, and I want to thank Gary and the entire Consumer Protection Division for everything they have done leading up to the event. It is incredibly important to the City Attorney's Office to continue to be educating the community about fair housing rights and to be educating housing providers about their responsibilities under the law. So this is one of many efforts in that regard, and I am grateful to for all of the work that has gone into it. It's an excellent event, and we are so happy that you are all here to join us. I also want to thank Senator Harris. It was really a tremendous privilege to get to hear from you and very inspirational, so thank you for being here. It is my great pleasure to introduce my dear friend Kevin Kish, the director of the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Kevin was appointed by the governor and confirmed by the California legislature in 2015 and 2016, respectively. He leads a team of 220 in enforcing civil rights laws across California. It is the largest state civil rights agency in the country, and it is a civil rights agency that is constantly thinking forward. Under Kevin's leadership, the office continues to educate the public, investigate complaints, and bring enforcement actions to enforce California civil rights laws across employment and housing. one particular case that I want to highlight that I think is a great example of creative activity and ways not just to think about what do the laws say, but what do they mean, and what do they mean in today's world, is a case that was brought in relation to Airbnb. You may have seen in the news there was a UCLA student driving to Big Bear, I believe, who had reserved a room through Airbnb. On the way, she texted a host to ask about the accommodations and received a blatantly racist reply that said something to the effect of, "I would never host you because you are Asian." She filed a complaint with the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. And as part of the settlement in that case was reached both with the host and with Airbnb. As part of the settlement with the host agreed to participate in education, training, and volunteering, all with respect to civil rights laws. So a win overall in educating, in changing hearts and minds, and in working together to try to make things a better place overall. With respect to Airbnb, though, an even more important settlement. Airbnb actually agreed to collect stats on how guests by race were being responded to by hosts, and to provide that information to the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. An incredible settlement. I have not asked and will not ask how hard it was to get, but I can't imagine it was easy. And really a very forward way of looking at civil rights laws. Also, as part of that settlement, if a guest complains about racial discrimination to Airbnb, that guest is immediately informed in California of their right to file a complaint with the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. So a meaningful and creative settlement with significant prospective impact. Prior to DFEH, Kevin was at BEDSETIC, a legal rights organization where he directed the employment rights section. There he was responsible for a $1 million settlement with car washes, 4 car washes across the Los Angeles region for wage theft. And I don't have my notes in front of me, so I'm going to guesstimate, I apologize, Kevin, at $20 million settlement with Schneider Logistics, a major Walmart distributor operating out of the Inland Empire. Incredible work across the board. Kevin learned much of what he knows from U.S. District Judge Myron Thompson, a civil rights legend in his own right in Montgomery, Alabama. And it was my great pleasure to be a law school classmate. I'm grateful to him being here today and also for everything I've learned from him along the way. The John Lewis quote about get out there and do something. Kevin's someone who gets out there and does something every day. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Lane. Those of you who live in Santa Monica, actually, is there a different mic here, or am I good? I need to use this. Okay. All right, I will hold it up. Those of you who live in Santa Monica are so lucky to have a city attorney of the integrity and caliber of Lane. I do not live in Santa Monica. I live on the other side of town, but I've considered moving here just to be within your sphere of influence. She's great. And I also want to thank Deputy City Attorney Gary Rhodes for working with us all, and of course Senator Fred Harris and Chancellor Al-Mansour for sharing this forum with me. It's my job to turn our focus a little bit to our state of California. And I want to take you back to a time even before the events that were described by Senator Harris. Because for much of the first half of the 20th century, a few California legislators had been trying to pass some form of anti-discrimination laws totally unsuccessfully. And that really changed when a very gifted legislator from Oakland took office by the name of Byron Rumford. And Byron Rumford, first of all, was the first African-American state legislator from Northern California. He was also, interestingly, in the 1930s, he became the first African-American pharmacist licensed by the California Board of Pharmacy. And he became a pharmacist after failing the exam on a number of occasions. And the reason he failed the exam was because the Board of Pharmacy asked him questions that had nothing to do with pharmacy that they did not ask of white applicants. So he appealed and was eventually given his license and operated what became a famous pharmacy in Oakland and then became a legislator and did a ton of work on a number of different issues, including environmental issues and children's issues. But when he really passed, with the support and help of a number of other legislators, including Hawkins from LA, when he really passed civil rights legislation was in 1959, and there were two major laws that passed in 1959. One was the Unruh Civil Rights Act, and this is a law that prohibited discrimination, in all business establishments throughout the state, including in housing. So this was kind of the foot in the door in housing. That is a law that is still on the books. We still enforce it today at the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Local prosecutors can enforce it, and the Attorney General of California can enforce it. Also in 1959, they passed the Fair Employment Practices Act, and this was really the first real toothy law that outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, and religion in employment. And the other thing that the law did, which is important for me and at least one other person, Wayne Cotledge, who's one of my colleagues who's here, thank you for being here, Wayne, is it created something called the Fair Employment Practice Commission. And that is the predecessor to the agency that I now lead. And it was intended to take complaints and resolve them. So, after those successes, what's next? Housing. And they fought for it. And they fought for a couple of years. And they finally got something passed. And my understanding is that it basically took Byron Rumford personally cajoling and wheedling and using some pretty impressive political instincts to convince people to sign on to this, to a Fair Housing Act, the California Fair Housing Act, which is called the Rumford Fair Housing Act. And it was signed by Governor Pat Brown, the father of our current governor, and it became effective on September 30th, 1963. And that act was enforced by the same commission, which was called the Fair Employment Commission. And I want to highlight what it covered and what it didn't cover, because it actually didn't cover a lot of stuff that today we would expect it to. It covered public housing, and it covered publicly funded housing, and it covered apartment buildings that had 3 or more units. But it did not cover privately financed single-family homes or duplexes. And I happen to have a report from the first year of enforcement. This is the report, and I want to talk to you about what they saw at that time. There were 135 housing complaints filed in that first year after September 30th, 1963. 95% were race or color complaints. And I want to tell you the exact numbers because I find them interesting. 125 cases involved African Americans. 3 cases involved Asian Americans, which at the time this report was published meant people of East Asian descent, Japanese, Chinese, I would imagine, although they didn't specify. 6 cases based on national origin, 3 involving people with a Spanish surname, so they didn't use the words Latino or Hispanic in this report, 1 American Indian, 1 East Indian, and 1 Greek person filed complaints. There was a single complaint based on religion filed by a Jewish person. And the forms of discrimination described in this report are classic forms of discrimination that many of us are familiar with. I was going to say from history books, but actually I wish we were familiar with them from history books, but it's not in a lot of history books. But it's the kind of discrimination where you call an apartment complex, you see that there are vacancies in the advertisement in the newspaper, you show up, and when the rental agent sees the color of your skin, all of a sudden, there are no vacancies, or there's a waiting list, or the apartment has just been rented, I'm so sorry, or the owner has just decided to raise the rents this morning. Sorry about that. So those are the forms of discrimination that are described in this report. At the time it was issued, the status of the law, the Rumford Fair Housing Law, was really uncertain, and that's because the second the law was signed, a very fierce opposition was mounted, and there's some artifacts out front that have been collected and displayed showing some of the materials that were used during this campaign. The opposition to the Fair Housing Law was led by the Apartment Owners Association, by the Realtors Association, and by Chambers of Commerce. And I say that not to throw them under the bus, because today there are partners in enforcing fair housing laws, but to communicate just how powerful the opposition was. These were the most powerful players in housing in this state. And they got signatures to qualify an initiative to appear on the ballot. This is something that we all are familiar with when we look through at election time all of the many ballots that we're supposed to vote on. And the ballot measure that they got onto the November 1964 ballot was to amend the California Constitution. And the amendment, I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to explain what it means. This is the amendment, the relevant part of the amendment. Neither the state nor any subdivision thereof shall deny, limit, or abridge, directly or indirectly, the right of any person to decline to sell, lease, or rent such property to such person or persons as he, in his absolute discretion, chooses. What does that mean? Put in the California Constitution that people can discriminate in housing, plain and simple. The slogan for the campaign, which was kind of genius, a man's home is his castle. And this is something that I can tell you we hear all the time at the Department of Fair Employment and Housing in 2018. So about this time last year, I got this really amazing letter from the person who was appointed by Governor Pat Brown in 1959 as the chief of the Division of Fair Employment Practices. So he's my predecessor, technically. His name is Edward Howden. I think he's 99. He lives in San Francisco, and he was asking for a copy of a speech he had given in October 1963. So he gave this speech 1 month after the law passed, and just as the opposition to the fair housing law in California was heating up. And he delivered this speech at a state convention of the California Apartment Owners Association. So this is kind of like walking into the den of the lion. And we found this speech. And he used this speech to issue a warning. And I want to quote you directly from this speech. He's describing the types of people and the families for whom this new law guaranteed equal opportunities. And what he wrote, or what he said, was, how many of these Californians have the experience of moving freely in the American housing market, of being able to buy or rent in any area they can afford? You and I both know the answer to that question. It is a saddening answer, and it is an answer which gives rise to anger and to protest on the part of those who have decided that 1 century is long enough to put up with second-class citizenship in these United States. So he's my inspiration when I go talk to folks about fair housing. A year later, a year after he delivers this speech, Proposition 14, this is the ballot measure, it's on the ballot, and Californians vote 2-1 in favor. So the law is abolished. Not technically. No, the good law is abolished. The proposition passed to enshrine discrimination in the California Constitution. Californians voted 2-1 in favor of amending the state constitution to allow for private discrimination in renting and selling housing. Los Angeles County voted 67% in favor of amending the California Constitution. Santa Monica voted in favor of amending the California Constitution. And I think about that speech that my predecessor gave about that time, and I think about the remarks of Senator Harris about everything that was giving rise to civil unrest in 1967. So this happens in 1964. What happens in LA in 1965? Watts Uprising. All of these things, I agree, are linked together. So, meanwhile, as all of this is happening, there's a woman named Dorothy Mulkey. And she's an African-American woman. She's looking for an apartment with her husband in Orange County. I think they were in Santa Ana. And she is kind of this representative of all kinds of changes that were happening at the time. So she had served in the Navy, so she's reflective of the integration of the armed services. She's kind of at the tail end of the Great Migration. People are coming to California for opportunities. And I do want to pause just a second and note one of the ironies of California history in housing is that the only places that many African Americans could move into, could find to live in when they came for the economic opportunity in our shipyards and in our industries, were houses that had been vacated by Japanese Americans who were forcibly removed from them in World War II. And that's a great shame and irony of our state's history. So Dorothy Mulkey is looking for an apartment, and she famously says, like, I'm not paying attention to any of this stuff. Proposition 14, none of it. I need an apartment for me, my husband, and my baby. So she goes to an apartment building in Orange County, and the same thing happens, right? There's a vacancy. She shows up. All of a sudden, there's no vacancy. She knows something is up. She contacts the NAACP, and they do the classic form of fair housing testing, which is called paired testing. You send somebody of one race to the apartment building, see what the owner says. Then you send somebody of another race to the apartment building, see what the owner says. And they determined that there was discrimination at work. And so they brought this case. The case goes all the way up to the California Supreme Court in 1966. And the California Supreme Court declares that Proposition 14 is unconstitutional, that it violates the federal constitution, actually, the Equal Protection Amendment of the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And then the case goes even farther, up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court decides Reitman v. Mulkey in 1967. Interesting tidbit, the Solicitor General of the United States at this time is someone by the name of Thurgood Marshall, and he argues on behalf of the United States, which has come into the case as an amicus or a friend of the court to argue that the California Supreme Court was right, that there should not be discrimination in the California Constitution. And we won. And I say we won because I think we all won from that case. And we know what happened afterwards. We've just heard a lot about it. In 1967 and then in 1968, we have the assassination of Dr. King, and then the passage 1 week later of the federal Fair Housing Act. But there were consequences. So in 1966, this is before the U.S. Supreme Court has weighed in, Governor Pat Brown is defeated in his re-election campaign by Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan famously gives a quote in a speech during this campaign, and I quote, "I have never believed majority rule has the right to impose on an individual what he does with his property. This has nothing to do with discrimination. It has to do with our basic freedom." That was an unbelievably common sentiment at the time. Byron Rumford loses his campaign for the state senate that he was widely expected to win. And this has never actually been solved, but there's some very convincing evidence that electoral fraud was at work in this election in Oakland. This was one of the very first times that automatic voting machines were used, or voting machines of any kind as opposed to humans. And it appears that as many as 10,000 votes went uncounted. Rumford lost by about 600. And that Supreme Court decision that upheld the principles of non-discrimination in housing and said California can't allow this constitutional amendment to permit housing, that was a 5-4 decision. That was narrowly decided. And from the dissent said that there was no fact in the record to support the idea that the intent of the proposition was to authorize private racial discrimination in the housing market. It's one of those ones where you're like, that was literally the intent. Like, I don't know. So I say all that to say this has always been a long and hard fight. It was a long and hard fight then. It is a long and hard fight now. But there are some bright spots. So just 10 years after this proposition passes, where Californians overwhelmingly vote for discrimination, in 1974, 10 years later, they overwhelmingly vote to remove it, even though it had already been declared unconstitutional. So we see that intense struggle, and then we see all of a sudden a flip. People just accept, a majority of people accept that this is the reality and this is what we're going to do. Now, over the course of the decades between then and now, a lot has changed. The law has changed. It's become even stronger. And a lot of different categories have been added to the act, but two major ones are familial status, meaning families with children, and disability, which were two categories added in the 1980s. So what do we see today? I have the numbers from 2016 from the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. I don't have 2017 yet. In 2016, compared to 135 complaints in 1964, we got over 1,000 housing discrimination complaints. Disability is by far the largest number of complaints that we receive, about half of them. And race and familial status follow. We settled several hundred fair housing cases, and we filed 37 lawsuits to enforce our fair housing laws. And some of what we see takes the same form as what was reported in this report. Lane gave the example of the young Asian American woman who was told, we aren't going to rent to you. One reason, one word says it all, Asian. We have a gay couple who were trying to rent an apartment in Mammoth, and we're told, we don't have to rent to people like you anymore after the election. Incorrect. We filed a case this month, so January 2018, a fourplex in Orange County where the property owner told our investigator, I hate Mexicans, greasy Mexicans can't park here, things of this nature, harassed the family so intensely, including breaking into their apartment on multiple occasions, that they were forced to call law enforcement and ultimately left in fear. So those are one category of case. Another category of case involve people who get into the housing market and have literally no idea that there are anti-discrimination laws. And so the role of education is an unbelievably important one for us. And I've been very surprised by the number of people who provide housing who don't have any idea about the laws or that the laws apply to them or what the laws say. So we all have a role to play in educating. And we work with people like the Realtors Association and the Apartment Owners Association to try to do that. So what is the future going to look like? One of the things that I've been reflecting on is when we conduct business, so think about the Unruh Civil Rights Act, we very frequently don't have to walk down to Main Street to buy toilet paper, right? We can do it on our computers or on our phone. It is an online transaction, much shopping. When we work, we don't even actually have to go into an office, although many people do have to go into workplaces. But when we apply for work, we might not be applying in person. An algorithm might be selecting our resume out of a bunch of other ones. Now, this has some potential to diminish the types of discrimination that we've seen in the past, but we also know that it has the potential to replicate discrimination moving forward. And in housing, I think it's particularly interesting, and that's because housing is one area that we cannot go online, right? We cannot live in the cloud. We have to have bricks and mortar around us, right? So there's always going to be a need for physical space for us to live in. But the ways we access housing do change. And the Airbnb case is one example. And in that case, what led to it, in addition to the complaint by the one woman, was a Harvard study. This Harvard professor created a bunch of bots that went onto the Airbnb platform and determined that there was statistically significant racial discrimination occurring. Now, most of the hosts were not doing it, but some small but existing percentage were systematically excluding African Americans from renting with them. Now, what can we do about that? That study was shut down because the terms of the platform are you can't create a false profile. So all of a sudden, the classic form of testing, right, the paired testing, is no longer possible because how do you test if you can't get onto the site? So one of the great things about our settlement is they are allowing us to test. And I have to say that a lot of the things, a lot of our preconceived notions about discrimination, I think we have to have an open mind about. One of the things that I assumed would be true is that pictures allow for discrimination. It turns out that maybe pictures aren't that relevant based on the data that we see. Names are more relevant in discrimination. Names that are identifiably African American, Mexican, of Spanish origin, what have you. The way we advertise for housing has changed. It's not a classified ad in the paper that can no longer say no Mexicans need apply. Instead, how do we get our housing ads? Well, very frequently online. And you all might have seen recent news reports that on Facebook, advertisers can apply filters to their ads. Some of those filters are perfectly legitimate. I want to target people who like a certain type of shirt. Some of the filters are race, ethnicity, age, gender. And when applied to housing or employment opportunities, those are unlawful. But we as consumers will never see it because we won't ever even see those ads. We won't know what opportunities are not available to us if the algorithms prevent us from seeing them in the first place. Civil rights law has to confront this. We all as a society have to confront this. So, finally, I agree with Senator Harris, and particularly here in California, we have a housing crisis. And whenever there's any kind of crisis, the people who lose are the people who are most vulnerable. And it's our role together to combat those situations where people are being treated unfairly. So I want to just end with a summary of another case that we filed again this month in January 2018 here in Los Angeles, a man with multiple disabilities. He lives in an apartment complex in Center City. He's a Section 8 tenant, and most of his income comes from an SSI check, so a disability benefit check. The catch is, he generally gets his check sometime between the 3rd and the 5th of the month. Rent is due on the 1st. And so for years, that wasn't a problem because the landlord was like, yeah, I get it. Your check comes in on the 3rd. I'll take your rent on the 5th. New owner. All of a sudden, that's not cool. And he receives multiple eviction notices. They're trying to get rid of him. So 2 things are going on here. One, this is a classic failure to accommodate a person with a disability. There is no universe in which it's not a reasonable accommodation to allow this guy to pay his rent on the 5th when he gets his money on the 3rd. But the other thing that's going on is the housing crisis, because it's not hard to see behind what this new owner of the building's purpose is, which is to get rid of the guy who can't pay as much as the market rate might allow. So when these forms of discrimination exist and persist, they demean, I believe, all of us. This is the city where we live. This is the state and the country where we live. When this is happening to someone, it's happening to us collectively. And the battle for equality that we've heard described, that we're engaged in, is not something that is won and then put aside. I believe it's a practice. It goes on. It's something that we all engage in. And it requires our attention and commitment over years and decades. And there are moments that we perceive as setbacks, and we've heard about many of them. I think we're living in a moment that many of us perceive as a setback. But we've also seen that these moments of setbacks have in the past often propelled us towards a greater commitment to fairness and equality. And whether that happens now is up to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Our final speaker is Chancela Al-Mansour. Chancela is the Executive Director of the Housing Rights Center, one of the largest fair housing organizations in the country and the largest nonprofit. Since becoming the ED at the Housing Rights Center in 2010, Chancela has grown the agency to the point where it now investigates hundreds of complaints each year, and that includes a killer paired testing program. Kevin mentioned paired testing. And she oversees an annual average of 65 cases filed in federal court or state court out of the Housing Rights Center's litigation department or referred to DFEH or HUD. Before her time at HRC, Chancellor worked at Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles County for 16 years as a staff attorney and then directing attorney of the Housing and Consumer Law Unit. She serves on the board of the Community Reinvestment Coalition and is an active member of the National Fair Housing Alliance and Black Women's Lawyers of Los Angeles. She is a graduate of Vassar College and the UC Davis School of Law, which is where I first met her. Chancla has helped many hundreds of clients directly to fight successfully for their rights, especially their civil rights in housing. And she, along with that, she has a great passion for her work, and that's made her one of the leaders for fair housing in California, and especially here in Los Angeles. So it's my great privilege to welcome my good friend, Chancela Al-Mansour.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm going to start now. Chancela Al-Mansour from the Housing Rights Center. Just a little bit about the Housing Rights Center. We're the nation's largest fair housing council. We have 3 offices, Koreatown, Pasadena, and Van Nuys, as well as a lot of different clinics and workshops we do throughout LA County. We represent the city of LA County, the county and the city of Los Angeles, as well as Ventura counties as well. The last few weeks I've been going up to Ventura quite a great deal to assist persons who've been affected by the St. Thomas fire. Hundreds of people are still evacuated. They don't know what's going to happen. It's really hit renters really hard because they're facing a lot of health problems with the smoke inhalation, all this. and no good news in sight in terms of getting back into their rental properties. So it's just something that fair housing touches a lot of different things. It even touches disasters in terms of where assistance is, who needs assistance, and so forth. And so the Thomas Fire is really on our mind as well. We do landlord-tenant counseling, education, and outreach. We receive discrimination complaints. We investigate them. And we also have attorneys, so we will litigate a case if it looks as if the violation is going to continue and the person needs our assistance as well. So just a little bit. I know the writing it's kind of hard to see here, but I'm going to talk, as was said in the introduction, about discrimination locally. And Los Angeles and the County of Los Angeles, including Santa Monica, has a huge history when it comes to segregation and discrimination in housing and in zoning and land use ordinances and so forth. My time is limited. I'm just going to talk about a little bit of this and about this particular area. If you'd like to hear more, I could always talk at some other time about how neighborhoods became the neighborhoods that they are, not just locally, but also in the San Gabriel Valley and the San Fernando Valley and the South Bay and South Los Angeles as well. It's a fascinating history in terms of how discrimination has occurred and the impact it had on where people live today. So here's just an example of Leimert Park. Not too far away from here, Leimert Park was an area that received a lot of funds. It had a lot of neighborhood revitalization. It was initially an all-white community. And this is an advertisement to get people to come and purchase new homes in Leimert Park. And in the first line, it says, "Why not investigate Leimert Park, where a permanent, non-expiring plan of beneficial restrictions absolutely ensures the security of your investment." So the bottom line is there is restrictions. We're keeping those restrictions. It's going to keep your property and this neighborhood white, primarily. Just a really quick little thing right here, if you see there, that you could purchase at that point a 4-family flat for $1,700. So this was in the late 20s, early 30s. And this map's even harder to see, but this, has anybody ever seen this map before? This was a map that the U.S. government released. It was first released in 1933, was updated in 36 and 39. I think this is the 36 version of that map. It was, there was an agency in the U.S. government. It was called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and they're the ones that developed these maps throughout all of the United States. And it was during the time of the New Deal, President Roosevelt, obviously in the 1930s, in the early 1930s especially, this country was going through a great economic depression, and a lot of people who were fortunate enough to have homes at that time were losing their homes or at risk of losing their homes because they couldn't pay the mortgage. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about this, but I want to first talk a little bit about restrictive covenants before I go into what the U.S. government did. So restrictive covenants were basically written covenants or promises in mortgages and lease agreements and other type of deeds to transfer property that said that it could not be transferred to certain people of certain races. Santa Monica has, the reason why it has a great percentage of single-family homes is because it was actually a concerted effort on the part of the Santa Monica government to restrictively to zone certain areas as only R1 single-family zoned areas. And there was a black community. It's not quite there so much anymore, but it was in the part of Santa Monica that was between Pico, so north of Pico, south of Wilshire, and it actually did go pretty adjacent to the ocean, specifically to Ocean Park and to Sunset Park. And those were the only integrated neighborhoods in Santa Monica. By raise of hands, anybody grow up in Santa Monica? So you probably know more than I do, so feel free to chime in as you may have personal experiences in growing up here. When working class families could afford to purchase a home, blacks were largely excluded. And then in 1933, when the U.S. government started, through the Homeowners Loan Corporation, started to develop these maps were to help homeowners be able to keep their homes who had defaulted, as I said before. So in this map where it says Los Angeles, just north of there, that's basically Santa Monica, the Pacific Ocean. In the red areas, which is kind of like right above there, red area right in here in the Boyle Heights area, red area going down South LA, going down towards San Pedro. Those were the areas that were predominantly Black, Mexican, and then lower income, new foreign whites as well that were not cared for by the majority. So we're talking Jews, Greeks, some Italians, and some Irish as well. We're in these areas of Boyle Heights, going down to South LA and a little bit north as here as well. So the U.S. government designed these maps. This is where the term redlining comes from this map, because the areas that were Black and the other ethnic groups that I talked about were in red. So if you wanted to have a home to get a loan, or to get a loan for not only for purchase for a new home, but also for your improvements, you had to live outside the red area. And anyway, this is part of our past right here. So not only did the Homeowners Loan Corporation help homeowners be able to keep their home during the Depression, it also generated about 1 million loans. These are federally backed loans. And even when the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, was created a few years later, and the FHA was the agency that brought in private and financial institution lending, they were still federally backed loans, regardless of whether or not the U.S. government backed those loans or whether or not non-federal institutions were brought in to back these loans. So basically, you could not get a loan without going through either the FHA or through the U.S. government or through a private institution. So this past really did keep Blacks and a lot of other persons as well from even being able to enter into the homeownership market. So I say this a lot of times. I say this now because people say, because of gentrification or displacement, I can't, live where I want to live. Well, basically, our past has prevented a lot of people of color from living where we wanted to live from basically going back to 100 years ago. In the 1930s, as a matter of fact, there were more FHA, these are the federal program loans, there was more FHA lending activity in California than in any other state. Our government really put a focus on this as well. And so in this area here, and I wish I could really point to other areas as well, but I'm just going to point out one, the Chavez Ravine area and the Bunker Hill area of downtown LA. These were other areas that were kind of redlined, which opened the door for when the city of Los Angeles started its urban renewal program in the 1930s. This is what led to the displacement of Mexican Americans who lived in the Chavez Ravine area, so that the LA Housing Department could develop higher income homes. And initially, those homes were told the Mexican American families who lived along the Chavez Ravine area that they would be able to be first in line to purchase these homes. The homes were never developed. The land, after the families were pushed off the land and their businesses were closed and their post office and their library and their schools were shut down, and the LA River was concreted in. It used to be a vibrant river where you could fish and so forth, but because of the Ford industry and motor cars in the 1930s, they didn't want people to use the river as transportation and for a livelihood. They wanted people to get on the freeways, so they concreted in the entire LA River that runs along, this part of LA City, and led to the displacement of the Mexican American community in the Chavez Ravine area. Ultimately, a lot of people blame the LA Housing Department for this, and rightfully so to a large degree. And a lot of people also blame the LA Dodgers, then the Brooklyn Dodgers, saying that they're the ones that led to the displacement. But the Brooklyn Dodgers, later the LA Dodgers, actually were just the beneficiary of a land that was completely vacated or caused to be vacated. And then, like I said, the ultimate plan was not to build housing probably anyway. So the LA Dodgers were able to purchase the land for fairly cheap. So, has anybody ever heard of Inkwell Beach? Let's see, you've heard of Inkwell Beach. Inkwell Beach was, and this is a picture I think this picture is from 1931. And Inkwell Beach was a 2-block part of the Santa Monica Beach. It was the only part of the entire beach that goes along this part of Santa Monica, Los Angeles, past Manhattan Beach, where Blacks could go and not be harassed, not be threatened by the Ku Klux Klan, and beaten and so forth. And it's just a 200 stretch near the Ocean Park area. these are families enjoying their time on Inkwell Beach. I just wanted to, I'm sorry, that photo is from 1928. So right here you see the man standing, he's underneath the sign that says prohibited. That was actually the line where whites could be north of that line, or whites could be anywhere they wanted to be, but blacks were prohibited from going past that line on the beach. So there were actually markations about where blacks could be on the beaches as well. This photo is from 1925. I'm going to go back to this one before I go to this one. Go back to this one. So a little bit more locally. So if you, in terms of Los Angeles and how communities kind of came to be, if you travel down Arlington Boulevard in mid-city LA going towards Jefferson Park and West Adams, there was a 10-year period of time when restrictive covenants and other type of zones was kind of, the time period had sunsetted, and so blacks and Japanese Americans were able to purchase homes in that Leimert Park, Crenshaw area. If you drive down Crenshaw Boulevard, you'll see a lot of homes that are in the traditional Japanese style, and that's because of the large Japanese community that they were able to purchase homes in that area in this really short amount of time. That area also consisted of working class Eastern European Jews, as well as other persons as well who had been discriminated against, and it was this way probably through the 1950s as well. Boyle Heights. In the Boyle Heights area, Boyle Heights was considered to be the melting pot of Los Angeles. It was historically German and then later Jewish community, then later Japanese community, and Filipino as well. It is now predominantly a Latino community, but Boyle Heights area was always deemed to be low-graded by the U.S. government, by the map I showed you previously. So homeowners there always had a difficult time getting home loans, especially for home improvements and so forth, which contributed to the blight. And so a lot of times, just in general, if you drive around Los Angeles, at least before gentrification displacement, you saw a lot of areas that looked like it was suffering from blight. The homes weren't being well kept, lawns and so forth. A great majority of the time, that's because they did not have the access to credit in order to get the home low interest or no interest home loans to do the improvements to their properties as well. As a matter of fact, in 1936, FHA, the federal agency that I talked about before, published the Underwriting Manual, and it was actually a well-publicized and distributed manual. And this focused more on appraisals for individual mortgages than it did for neighborhood risk. I'm going to see if I have, I'm sorry. It's later in the slides, so I'm not going to try to get to it right now. But so when it talked about individual mortgages, in the underwriting manual, the FHA actually did a type of determination or analysis to determine which neighborhoods were at risk, and it coincidentally identified those red areas as being the ones at higher risk, which meant that not only were they not entitled to home loans, but a lot of those areas were also discriminated against in other ways, and for other lending products that came out later, they were basically denied any lending products whatsoever. And I'm just going to read you a line in the FHA underwriting manual. It said, "If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy contributes to the instability and decline in property values." So this is, again, from the U.S. government, basically mandating that there be restrictions based on race and so forth. There is also, and I'm not going to get into it because of the time, but there's also a history about banks and financial institutions, such as the Los Angeles Security, First National Bank, and their and other financial institutions, really bad history when it comes to lending to black community, to black families, and to other people in general. A huge problem that has, in a lot of people's opinion, has continued to this day in terms of the lack of financial access to financial credit and so forth. So before I get to him, I'm going to talk a little bit more, just for a quick second, about Inkwell. And that is one thing I thought that was really interesting. I'd heard about Inkwell and so forth, but I wanted to do a little bit more research about it and how it came to be. In 1922, there was actually a group of African-American investors who bought a large area of land that was at the end of Pico Boulevard, and they were going to develop an amusement park and a resort and so forth. But about 600 white Santa Monica residents showed up to protest at a city council meeting, and so city council then passed an ordinance that barred this development from going up. At the time, the city's black population was only about 300 out of a total of about 15,000. And so in this area, actually where the resort was going to be is where Shutters is right now on the beach, is where this huge amusement park and resort was going to be built. It tried to happen many times again. As a matter of fact, the Nobel Peace Prize winner Ralph Bunche was in the area, and he as well tried to get this another development to happen, but it was never allowed to be developed. A lot of this area was in the area near the Phillips Chapel Christian Church, which was the first African-American church in Santa Monica. And so there was a proximity between the church and this area as well. And there were other businesses as well. There were, restaurants, and there was places to go and so forth. But because of the Klan and other racial incidents that happened, after a while, after time, it wasn't allowed to develop and so forth. So this man right here, I just want to talk a little bit, just to mention him as well, because there's a plaque that talks about him and also talks about the Inkwell Beach Resort as well. I want to say it's on, does anybody know where the plaque is, where the memorial is? Do you know, can you tell me where? It's the end of Bicknell. On the beach.
Where the actual Inkwell area is, there's a palm tree and an entire kind of sitting area.
Okay, because I went looking for it. I couldn't find it, but I'm going to go back to that area. But, yeah, but anyway, like I said before, it's a very interesting and very interesting time as well. I'm sorry, I'm trying to find, this is the first, I'm trying to find his name because I just had it. Thank you. Yeah, Countabon. He was the first Latino and African-American well-known surfer in the 1920s. He died at the age of only 24 years old in an accident as well, but he was really well-known, and he really helped to kind of raise the character of the area as well. And so I found a picture of him, and so I just wanted to talk a little bit about him as well. So I just have a couple of articles. One is from Westside Today about some of the cases that the Housing Rights Center has had. In this case, we talk about cases that we've had where we represented people who are being discriminated against because they had children. In this case, this was a big case in 1986. This was one of the largest awards at that time where it was an African-American woman and her white husband were being discriminated against. And there was lots of things that happened to them as well. And then also wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to the city of Santa Monica. I even have a quote down below from Gary Rhodes with the city attorney's office about the success that the city of Santa Monica had in passing an ordinance which was upheld after it was challenged by the Apartment Owners Association, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of having a Section 8 or a subsidized housing voucher, as saying that it's covered under a source of income protection as well. So as the director, Kevin Kish, gave a great shout out of Santa Monica, I want to as well, because this is a great, yeah. So, and in case, I'm really apologize. His full name was Nicholas Rolando Galdeban. He lived from 1927 to 1951 when he was killed at a very early age. But since we're talking about Santa Monica, I just wanted to highlight him as well. He grew up in Santa Monica, went to Santa Monica High. So I want to talk about him. Contact information. Thank you very much for including the Housing Rights Center as well. And this is the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. Hopefully it will stay a very strong act for a long time to come. Thank you.